Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast, our new series, Apocalypse Now, the nuclear scenario. We live in an era obsessed with the end of all things, with doomsday. I suppose there's always been some fascination with this topic, but there are just so many groups these days, all loud and extreme, each with their own central idol of the apocalypse, one that they both fear and seemingly long for. At the very least, they seem to enjoy spending a lot of time thinking about it. How will the end come? Whose fear-mongering death cult will be right about the source of our doom? What will our post-apocalyptic society look like? How long will it survive before all life is completely extinguished? And what can you buy to prep for all this? Instead of just worrying, instead of just increasing our stress levels, which every study out there shows worsens our health and shortens our life, let's look at these things head on. What are we afraid of exactly? And which of these things are something we really should fear? What degree of fear is proportional and a reasonable amount for each possibility? And when does it become paranoia? Most important, what can we actively do to change course? Let's roll up our sleeves and get real. Instead of letting those who get excited thinking about how they're going to become rooftop snipers in a sci-fi movie, or those who want to sell us something, get to us. One threat, left over from the previous century, is nuclear war. People don't fear it to the same degree they did during the Cold War, but we still fear it. And reasonably so, with so many mad dictators casually tossing around threats of using it as part of their common everyday bravado, like children with toy guns pointing them at everyone as they shout, "Bang, bang!" Except the guns are real. They do have nukes. At least in the Cold War, they respected the awful power of what they had, even if they still resorted to playing chicken a few times. It's time to put the adults back in charge. Not whoever is most childishly entertaining, or even who is the most politically correct. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I like my politicians boring and effective. The less I have to worry or even think about them, the better. And we've all been having to worry about them too much for too long. Enough of this foolishness. Let's start with the Cold War, when fear of nuclear fallout was at its highest. Nukes have been around for a while now, and they've only been unleashed in war once. That alone is one reason for comfort. But when that happened, 8 decades ago, only one nation in the whole world had them. There was no threat of nuclear war because there was no one who could fire back. Once other nations got the bomb, once communist spies gave the bomb to the USSR, so McCarthyism wasn't wrong about everything, apparently, since that is how the communists got their hands on what their scientists couldn't figure out how to develop on their own. Then the world faced its first threat of nuclear war. And it has still never happened. Mutually assured destruction has worked. People demonize it today as utterly immoral, despicable even. And hey, fair enough. But one fact you can't argue with is it has worked. No one has ever actually unleashed the bomb, even dictators, because they knew that even before it reached its intended victims, it would be detected and retaliatory nukes would be fired back on the initiator. The knowledge that if you nuke someone, you will be nuked. If you kill an entire population, your own people will die as well. A twisted version of you jump, I jump has successfully stopped this from happening. So far. Reagan has a reputation as a hardcore war hawk president. But his position on nuclear war may not match the image you have in your head. The Day After series had a profound impact on Ronald Reagan and led to the Reagan reversal. When taken through a drill for nuclear fallout, he refused to press the button, even in a dry run rehearsal. He decided that if Russia fired on America, killing a bunch of innocent Russian civilians in retaliation wasn't going to stop the Americans from dying, so he refused. Even in that scenario, he would not condemn the world to mutually assured destruction. But he was smart enough to keep that a mostly private, moral stand of his. Publicly, he continued to deter any attack with the implied promise of retaliation. Unbeknownst to him, the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, had a similar rehearsal and arrived at the same conclusion. He would not fire back on America even if he was fired on first. These two leaders brought about the end of the Cold War and saw the Iron Curtain fall. Ronald Reagan became a hero, but Mikhail Gorbachev ended his days in exile right here in the United States. Together, they were able to significantly reduce the number of nukes in existence throughout the world during the Cold War era, convincing multiple countries to de-escalate and even completely disarm. Ukraine, for example, gave up their nuclear weapons on the promise that the United States would protect them from Russia if they were attacked and no longer had their nuclear program as part of their defense. At our peak in 1986, the world contained 70,000 nuclear weapons. These two leaders both wanted to decrease that number. But Margaret Thatcher pointed out that you can't unring the bell and you can't uninvent the bomb. A nuke-free world was not a realistic, feasible possibility, because the evil tyrants would always seek to make themselves the most powerful by secretly making themselves the only nuclear-armed power. The only way to prevent them from becoming nuclear was to have some good nations, likewise armed, to continue on with a smaller-scale threat of mutually assured destruction. Still, with work, the overall number of threats could be decreased. Some nations, like Ukraine, that were nuclear, are not any longer, and other nations that have sought to become nuclear have been prevented from doing so. Yet there are still 12,500 nukes in the world today, kept by 9 nations, according to Hans Christensen, who leads the Nuclear Notebook Group under the Federation of American Scientists. The main variable in that calculation is North Korea, since they do not participate in transparency with the other 8 nuclear nations, who at least claim to be open about their nuclear programs. The 9 nations that are armed with the bomb are America, Russia, the UK, France, India, Pakistan, China, North Korea, and Israel. The numbers are supposedly accurate because each of the countries do not just take the other country's word for it. Each of the transparent countries sends inspectors to the other countries and vice versa. In cases of war, such as the present situation with Russia, these inspections are not taking place. And as mentioned before, North Korea refuses to participate in any kind of transparency at any time. North Korea officially has 50 nuclear weapons, according to the CIA. But private organizations that don't work for the government put the number as high as 130. And even the transparent countries have every reason to lie and have a few secret facilities with some extra backup. A plant in Texas called Plantex is America's only nuclear weapons assembly and disassembly facility. Of course, its details are extremely classified, otherwise it would be at the top of any enemy's strike list. All that enriched uranium. The plant was begun in 1942 and sits in the center of 16,000 acres north of Amarillo in the Texas Panhandle. The Defense Department explains America's nuclear program as a triad. The nuclear triad is made up of underground silos, nuclear-armed submarines, and nuclear-armed bombers. The silo branch consists of 400 linked silos across the country, but these locations can be found via GPS, making them the most easily targetable branch of the triad. The 14 nuclear-armed, nuclear-powered submarines are known as the handmaidens of the apocalypse. These submarines cruise around invisibly, each having as many as 90 nuclear weapons aboard. The last side of the triad is the 66 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and the old-school B-52 bombers. These planes are the only part of the triad that can be recalled, so it would be the first line to be used. This nuclear triad is the very definition of FAFO, or bleep around and find out. While the planes use simple gravity to deploy their bombs, the subs and the silos both use ballistic missiles for their nukes, meaning once they are launched, they cannot be stopped. But the planes are slower than the ballistic missiles. They have to be launched and flown to the target before they can drop their bombs. During that time, they can be recalled. Of course, once they fire, it's bombs away for them too. These planes are always kept ready for launch, with crews manning them 24/7, 365 days a year. If you want to go to my Substack article, you can see photos of all of the things being discussed in this article. Some of the stealth photos are pretty cool. The planes are both the first and last option that would actually be used. Their ability to be recalled during flight, allowing for a change in information, makes them the first choice. However, the hours it would take for them to reach their target and drop the bomb from above makes them the last choice in a situation where you are firing back because you've been fired on. Once fired on, we would only have minutes to retaliate. Many of the planes also require being refueled in midair in order to reach their likely destinations. So, depending on who we were retaliating against, in the event of a sudden nuclear strike, there would be no one to refuel them. It would be a Doolittle-style suicide mission. According to sonar, Russia and China both regularly send their submarines within a couple hundred miles of the U.S. coast in practice runs. Admiral Michael Connor, the former commander of the nuclear submarine force, uses the comparison that it is harder to find a submarine on the floor of the world's oceans than it is to find a grapefruit-sized object in space. Whether nuclear war were to start over an actual mistake or accident, a miscalculation or misunderstanding, or a psycho madman, the threat is real. We've come close before. If nuclear war was ever launched against the United States, we probably wouldn't even be around to find out which of these scenarios was the one that had ended it all. The tactical nukes that Putin keeps threatening to use are battlefield nukes, things the United States doesn't even keep anymore. It's the mother of all bombs and battlefield equipment, meant to be detonated there on the battlefield. What the United States has are nuclear warheads that are strapped to rockets known as intercontinental ballistic missiles, or IBMs. They are hypersonic. It takes less than 30 minutes for them to reach their targets, which happens in 3 phases. The first phase is the boost phase, which takes 5 minutes. The mid-course phase takes about 20 minutes, and the terminal phase takes 100 seconds. Between the United States and Russia, firing on the other would take about 26 minutes and 40 seconds till impact. Between the United States and North Korea, it would take less than 33 minutes. The space-based infrared satellite system, or SIBRS, is an army of satellites in geosync, meaning they can park in space and stay there, watching any given nation for any signs of exhaust from a ballistic missile launch. In the seconds that the missile is actually being launched, the flare of exhaust is visible. These satellites spot it and alert the United States' 3 command centers: Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, the National Military Command Center beneath the Pentagon, and the bunker beneath Stratcom in Nebraska. Cheyenne Mountain is the brain, the Pentagon is the heart, and Stratcom is the muscle of any potential nuclear war. Within 150 seconds, these centers and their partners at the Space Force begin calculating where any missile that has been launched is aiming for. Within minutes, they know of anything headed for the United States, and the president would then be informed. The president would have to make a decision at that point about any counterattack under the launch on warning protocol. Meaning, if we were under a sudden rogue attack known as a bolt out of the blue, we don't have to wait until impact before being justified in retaliating. You even fire at us, we fire back. The assumption is that any strike against the United States would be targeting its silos, severely limiting our ability to retaliate if there was a delay in a decision. Therefore, the accepted scenario is that those silos would fire back before the ballistic missile fired on them ever reached American soil. In that moment, the president is allowed to order a retaliatory strike, but that final decision is his, and only his. And such a moment, the moment when a sitting president would receive a call asking him to make an immediate decision that would affect the fate of the entire world, with only minutes to make it, is one that every person should consider as at least a part of the equation when selecting a presidential candidate to vote for into that office. Their age, competence, temperament, and capability to make the decision required of them in that moment may not be the most pressing matter of an election compared to issues that are actually taking place right now, but it should definitely be a factor in every election. This isn't a game. There are protocols in place to keep any missileer in the silos from going rogue, but these same systems are built to ensure that once the president gives the order, it cannot be overridden either. Dr. Glenn McDuff, the Los Alamos classified historian, said, when asked about anyone in the chain of command, at Stratcom or an individual missileer refusing to obey that order, he said, "You would have better odds of winning the Powerball than to have someone chosen for the nuclear command apparatus defy authority, or be able to get around the system to do it." Each base has 10 silos. Each silo has 2 missileer officers at all times, both with keys around their neck, and each officer is in charge of approximately 10 nuclear warheads. More than once an hour, red light alarms go off, kind of like Desmond on Lost. They pull up the code on their screen, which they type in. The screen verifies that this is an authentic code, then instructs them to turn their keys. They count down to turn their keys at the same time. Every time that happens, they don't know if it's the test or the real thing. When they enter the code, they don't know if they are going through a drill or actually firing for real. Also, the silos are all linked. So even if they somehow knew that this one was the real deal, and all of them refused to fire, if even one silo followed orders and those 2 missileers entered the code, the system would be activated, and all the intended silos would fire from that one order because they're linked. Plus, since this happens 24 times every day, It becomes routine. You wouldn't know you were actually firing until the moment after you had entered the code when you heard the nuke actually fire. If you even heard it, depending on which missile was fired and its distance from you. And by then, it would be too late. Even then, you would have no idea what was happening, why the order had been given to fire, or who the nuke you had just launched was aimed at. They are automatically set to target the ocean until after launch, in case someone went rogue. And only after launch are the coordinates put in by the command center. Russia's systems don't have these dispersed risk systems to guard against conscientious objectors deciding to defy orders, so the risks vary with each armed country according to their systems and safeguards. Contrary to very popular widespread belief, there is no effective interceptor program for nuclear war. People mistakenly believe that there must be some sort of Iron Dome for America when it comes to protecting us from nuclear attack. As covered in my How Not to Be a Nazi series, when Israel is fired on by terrorists, the Iron Dome calculates where the missile is heading. It then calculates an interception point and fires an anti-missile to blow up the threat in the sky. It does all of this within seconds. Many people mistakenly believe that a similar system capable of hitting a hypersonic intercontinental ballistic missile would be able to strike down a nuke fired at the United States. No such program exists. We do have an interceptor program, but not one capable of doing that. Our interceptor program has 44 interceptor missiles in total. 4 are in Santa Barbara, the other 40 are in Alaska. Russia has 1,674 nukes. If even 50 of these were fired, there is no way that they could all be shot down by 44 ballistic interceptor missiles. These interceptor missiles, called exo-atmospheric kill vehicles, don't even have an explosive in them. They rely on impact. They travel at between 14,000 miles an hour and 20,000 miles an hour, or 22,530 to 32,187 kilometers per hour, and the collision would take place 500 miles into space, or 805 kilometers. The Missile Defense Agency said it's like trying to take out a bullet with another bullet. The success rate is only 40 to 50%, unlike the Iron Dome that has a 90% success rate. Still, why do we only have 44 of these? The worst case scenario with a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack would be if it targeted the Pentagon. Targeting Washington, D.C. is a worst-case nightmare scenario when it comes to nuclear war. A 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb, equivalent to 1 million tons of TNT, striking D.C. would decapitate the nation's leadership for anyone that did not make it to the bunker known as Raven Rock, which would become the alternate military command center. Outside of Raven Rock, this nuke would kill around 2 million people. There would be an intense scramble to evacuate as many of the main leaders as possible from Washington, D.C., all in an atmosphere of chaos over who was in charge and what took priority at this unprecedented moment. The Pentagon itself would basically relocate, along with the president and other congressional leaders, to this bunker 70 miles outside of D.C. It's a quick helicopter ride, as long as you can get there before the EMP pulse takes out the chopper. The best bunkers we have are built to withstand a 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb. But no bomb shelter can survive being hit by several, even smaller, nuclear bombs. And if someone was crazy enough to launch nuclear weapons, they would almost certainly strike hard. It is considered a given by Professor Brian Toon, who is one of the 5 authors of the nuclear winter theory, that any city with an airport or industrial center basically any city in the top 800, would be a reasonable target for a nuclear strike. Even smaller cities near the silos would be targets, so no one would be safe. The president has a paramilitary team with him at all times who shadow him, called the Counter-Assault Team. It's run by the Special Agent in Charge, or SAC, and along with the Secret Service, they are responsible for getting the president to safety in these types of situations. Not an easy task while everyone else is trying to get necessary orders from him. Atomic bombs like the one dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are nothing compared to thermonuclear bombs like the ones we have today. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. The bomb dropped on Nagasaki was 20 kilotons. A thermonuclear bomb like the Ivy Mike thermonuclear device, which was the first thermonuclear weapon ever exploded, designed on paper by Richard Garwin when he was 24, and he's now 95, is a 10.4 megaton bomb. 1 megaton is equal to 1,000 kilotons. So a 10.4 megaton bomb is like 520 Nagasaki's. Its explosion, when tested, was as powerful as almost 1,000 Hiroshima bombs, all going off at the same time from the same central source. This explosion created 5 miles or 8 kilometers of solid fire, which doesn't even begin to count the force of the blast radius. At one point, the Russians had a 50 megaton thermonuclear bomb called the Tsar Bomba. Film of that monster detonating is scary. A hydrogen bomb and a thermonuclear bomb are two names for the same thing. Atomic bombs, like the ones dropped on Japan, were the early nuclear fission bombs. The hydrogen bomb uses nuclear fusion instead. Richard Garwin explains it this way. Keep in mind, a thermonuclear bomb uses an atomic bomb inside the weapon as the fuse. That gives you an idea of the power we are talking about in today's nuclear weapons. The old atom bomb, the most destructive bomb ever used in warfare, is merely the striking pin, the thing that starts the chain reaction for the actual explosion of today's weapons. When Robert Oppenheimer and John von Neumann were deciding at what height to detonate the bomb above Hiroshima, von Neumann calculated that it would kill the most people if it was 1,900 feet above the ground when it detonated, for which calculations he was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Eisenhower on February 15th, 1956. And Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita on seeing what he created. Now I have become death, the destroyer of worlds. When a nuclear device is exploded higher up, the blast kills more people. But if the bomb is exploded on the ground, the radiation poisoning is much more severe. When even a normal bomb explodes on the ground, huge amounts of earth are blown skyward into the air. When that happens with a nuclear bomb, all that soil is now irradiated, contaminating the entire area wherever it falls back to earth. When a bomb goes off above ground, like they did at Hiroshima, that radioactivity is dispersed into the atmosphere and carried away by the wind rather than contaminating the soil, which is why people can still walk around Hiroshima today, or why you can visit the Sudan crater in the Nevada desert where they tested a thermonuclear bomb, a crater so big it can be seen from outer space. They would not be able to do that if either of the bombs had been designed to detonate on impact, because the radiation would have been much longer lasting. If a 1 megaton thermonuclear bomb detonated 1,000 feet above the Pentagon, according to Army Manual 50, in which defense scientists documented the effects on people and things within each varying ring of the blast radius of the atomic bombs in Japan and our atmospheric testing in the Marshall Islands in the 50s, the first thing that happens is a flash of thermonuclear light that is 180 million degrees at its center point. That's equivalent to about 4 times the temperature at the center of our sun. The central mile, or 1.6 kilometers, is a pure fireball. Even cellular life is destroyed within this ring. Everything within 9 to 10 miles, or 16 kilometers from the center flash point, simply bursts into flames. Steel melts, streets turn to lava, people melt into other objects. Structures melt and collapse. The bulldozer of the blast moves out from there, producing winds of 200 to 400 miles per hour, or 320 to 640 kilometers per hour. Hurricane-level winds are 90 miles per hour, or 144 kilometers per hour. People within this radius would be set on fire, with third-degree burns, and buildings would be collapsing on them. We've all seen the famous mushroom cloud. The mushroom stem is created by an intense sucking inward and upward. People, telephone poles, cars, buildings, people who are nothing left but combusting carbon are all sucked inward in a reverse blast into the intense heat of that mushroom stem and up into the mushroom cloud. You can see this in the footage of the testing in the Nevada desert, the fake homes with the mannequins that they filmed during a nuclear blast. You can watch the blast push out, bowing everything, and then suck back in the opposite direction. Outside of this blast radius of unsurvivable destruction, there is the destruction of the rippling megafires. Broken electric lines snapping everywhere, setting hundreds of more fires that blaze outward, the only direction in which there is anything left to burn. It's like what happens if thousands of matches are set in a pile and provided with one spark. This causes between 100 and 200 square miles, or 160 to 322 kilometers, of domino effect fires. In a truly apocalyptic scenario, if hundreds of nuclear weapons were fired at the United States, by accident, by a misunderstanding, or by a madman, and the order was given by the president to preemptively strike back with equal or more force, or if allies joined in to strike the dangerous madman before he launched at them, this is what would set off what we call a nuclear winter. 1,000 bombs like this, and the 100 square mile fire zones they each create, would produce 33 billion pounds of soot, or 150 billion kilograms, that would be sent into the troposphere. This much soot, carried by the wind, would block out 70% of the sun's light and warmth for 7 to 10 years for the entire globe. Temperatures would drop by 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius. Bodies of water in the breadbaskets of the world, like Iowa and Ukraine, would freeze, and even in summer would only reach about 50 degrees or 10 degrees Celsius, according to this theory. So agriculture would fail, and famines would spread worldwide. Others argue that while northern climates would become uninhabitable, the climates near the equator would become the new breadbaskets of the world. Between the death tolls of the bombs themselves, in a scenario like this, with 2,000 weapons fired out of the 12,500 available, plus the widespread starvation that results under the theory of nuclear winter, The current estimations of the death toll would be 5 billion people, or over half the world's population. But of course, the people in the nations that were hit, the ones within them that lost electricity from the blast, would never know what was happening to the rest of the world, as uninvolved countries began experiencing the nuclear winter and the resulting famines. We've come close to this a couple of times, and not just during the famous Cuban Missile Crisis standoff. A nuclear submarine once went rogue. According to the former Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, in 1979, he received a report from the bunkers under STRATCOM and under the Pentagon that the Russians had launched ballistic missiles at the United States, both land-launched ICBMs and submarine-launched SLBMs. So he already had the necessary secondary confirmation needed to notify the president and ask for the order for a counterstrike. When suddenly someone realized that it was a VHS War Games training tape that was playing on the screens of these bunkers. It looked real because it was meant to look real, Bill Perry said. You can still hear the terror and trauma in his voice when he speaks of that moment, according to those who have interviewed him. The horror of having confirmation that this was happening, knowing that it was his duty to wake the president in the middle of the night and ask for orders regarding launching a nuclear war. Given the facts that this scenario would create a global catastrophe are hardly a secret among the nuclear-armed nations of the world, no one has ever launched on anyone else, despite the occasional bravado threats, because they all know how this ends. Only a madman would start this scenario, knowing that once they did, there was no escape for them or those they cared about either. But it does only take one. Putin is a cruel dictator who is not above assassinating his rivals, but he's not stupid, and he wants to survive. He's an intelligent man, despite the evil ends for which he often uses that intelligence. So the likelihood of someone like him starting a scenario like this is not that great. Out of the current 9 armed nuclear nations, the one most likely to pull a total madman scenario is North Korea. North Korea is the only one who doesn't play by the rules of even pretending to have transparency. All of the other 8 countries tell each other when they are going to launch an ICBM weapons test. They do this for the obvious reason of not wanting satellites to mistake this for the real thing and cause a preemptive counterstrike. But every time North Korea launches an ICBM test, it refuses to notify anyone. So each time it does this, it could potentially set into motion a scenario like the one described. Or, more likely, given that this hasn't happened yet, an actual strike launched by them could be mistaken for a test and dismissed. The mere fact that they are willing to risk a reaction where a test is mistaken for the real thing, rather than simply cooperate just the basic amount of notifying the world that it is a test, tells you they are run by a madman. To risk nuclear fallout every time you run a test, when a simple phone call would eliminate that possibility, and to choose to not make that phone call is something only a crazy person is capable of doing. Because of the Ukraine war, both the United States and Russia canceled their ICBM tests. Neither wanted to risk the other country mistaking their test for the real thing, even with pre-planned warnings during a time of heightened tensions like war. So even the pre-scheduled and pre-warned tests were canceled on both sides. Since January of 2022, North Korea has launched over 100 ICBM missiles unannounced. That's nearly 1 per week, causing panic every time at a time when the world is edgy and trigger-happy. If that's not the act of a raving lunatic, I don't know what is. That being said, the system has worked, and nothing has happened yet. It obviously could, especially with a madman at the helm of a nuclear power. He's willing to risk nuclear war in order to pose as menacing for the world, which only makes him look like a posturing infantile fool. But that doesn't mean he's willing to start a nuclear war by actually launching the real thing. He's a child, which is dangerous, but it's also pathetic. Like Margaret Thatcher, I disagree with those who think you can unscramble the egg. Reagan and Gorbachev saw eye to eye and were able to decrease the threat of nuclear war. That may be something we're able to continue, but even they understood via Thatcher that you could not unring the bell. Both Russia and the United States, and Britain for that matter, kept some nuclear weapons. If North Korea is crazy enough to risk starting a nuclear war that would destroy them along with everyone else, then obviously they're not capable of rationally deciding to give up their nuclear weapons, even if the rest of the world was willing to. And having the one madman on Earth be the only one who is armed doesn't exactly feel like we've made the world a safer place. Then he could attack without any fear of retaliation. But, as I pointed out, the status quo has held so far. Despite many close calls, despite the real possibility of something going wrong in the future, the systems have always prevented even tyrants and dictators from going into full-on madmen. All of them. Khrushchev played chicken with Kennedy, but he backed down rather than go off the cliff. Our focus needs to be on not upsetting the status quo that has worked for so long. No new nation should be allowed to go nuclear. Iran, most of all. They are trying. That is fact. And they must be stopped. That is also a fact. Even if it means dropping a non-lethal electromagnetic bomb to destroy their nuclear program. The fact is that the world was a safer place when Iran was broke. Since being funded, they have only spread genocidal warfare. In Israel, via Hamas, and in Yemen, via the Houthis. They have threatened and bullied the entire Middle East, every neighbor around them, fired hundreds of rockets at Israel, took over one of the world's shipping bottlenecks, which caused an environmental disaster when an oil rig sank on a coral reef, and have behaved like irresponsible barbarians. I'm sorry to be blunt, but someone has to. You don't give barbarian dictators nuclear weapons, much less one with a long history of carrying out brutal massacres like Iran. Every country in the West needs to make it clear to each of their own leaders that they expect them to stop Iran from becoming nuclear armed at any cost. And we need to make it clear to our leaders that if any one of them fails to do that, whatever else they might do, they will be removed from office. Every ounce of power that Iran has ever been allowed to have, it is used to take over, massacre, and oppress other parts of the world under its tyranny. Pakistan should never have been allowed to become nuclear, but Iran even more so. And if they try, when they try, well, that's the time to take a page out of the timely Top Gun sequel. The statistics cited in this article come from Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobson. Before we go, I've decided to give my election predictions. Since the first presidential debate is coming up this week, and it is unprecedented by coming before the conventions when the nominees are officially announced, I'll make a prediction. One I'm hoping I'm wrong about. I think this debate is a last-ditch demonstration to show that the Democrat Party gave Biden every chance to change his image in the public's mind. When he fails to do that, I believe the Democrat Party will switch their candidate for the convention. Probably they will do this by having some sort of story of some medical crisis which necessitates Biden stepping down. But either way, I believe that's their strategy. After that, I believe they will nominate Michelle Obama. I know. Everyone says she doesn't want the job. We've been being told she doesn't want the job for months and months. The steady stream of that assertion has been very conveniently repeated. I've thought all along, from the first time I heard it, that this was a setup for the moment when she would selflessly and heroically set aside her private feelings in order to make this sacrifice to save her country. I think the Democrats know they can't get Biden reelected. Between his disastrous policy and his undeniable mental decline, they have an insurmountable obstacle. Kamala Harris is tied to all his policy decisions, and she is notoriously unpopular as a candidate on both sides of the aisle. No one thinks she's capable, so running her would get them nowhere. I think they know that someone like Gavin Newsom's record also speaks for itself. He destroyed San Francisco when he ran that. They promoted him to run in California. He's devastated that state. I don't think anyone outside of California would vote for him as president. I think they're hoping that an unknown factor like Michelle Obama, combined with the appeal of potentially the first woman president, would distract people from their concerns about a second Biden administration, one that we truly cannot afford with the issues we have right now. With both of the current candidates being so unpopular, anyone new has an advantage. They would be counting on the public's willingness to take a risk when we can least afford it. Michelle Obama would solve the senility problem, but make no mistake, everything else would be the same as re-electing Biden. The economy, the border, the fentanyl crisis, the 2 wars we're involved in, the threat of Iran going nuclear, the rising crime rates, the changes to Title IX, it would all be the same under her. But they're hoping people won't notice that they would believe that a change in person would mean a change in policy. To their credit, they're smart, because that's a very real possibility. I just hope it's one that anyone who is concerned about our country doesn't fall for. I've said before I'm not a Trump fan. I'm still not. But I cannot, in good conscience, vote for anyone who would continue Biden's policies right now. To vote for Michelle Obama in this scenario would be a huge gamble that could mean 4 more years of this economy, this foreign policy that has allowed 2 wars, both with the potential to start a world war to happen, an absolute immigration crisis, the fentanyl epidemic, the out-of-control rise in crime, and much more, including serious issues like who is at the helm in a nuclear crisis or when Iran tries to go nuclear. And I believe that's a risk that our country can't afford to take. Which is why I'm making this prediction public, even though I may be proven wrong. And I hope I am. We may truly be looking at a Biden versus Trump election. But my money is on Michelle Obama being the Democrat nominee. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.